We've made some good progress on configuring iSCSI boot, but we need to take a step back and see the big picture and understand how exactly UCS uses the iSCSI vNICs in order to create an iSCSI boot connection across the network. By watching this nugget, we'll be able to explain exactly what an iSCSI overlay vNIC is and how it participates in the process of the iSCSI boot. When booting from iSCSI and we have these fabric interconnects involved, they are uplinked to the Ethernet network, which we call the LAN. And so we have several uplinks going here. And then typically what we have is we have a storage array sitting out there on the LAN somewhere. And it usually has two connections into the network, at least two connections for redundancy. And that's going to play a role in how we end up doing the configurations later, so we need to keep this in mind. Now, downstream of the fabric interconnects is where we have our server. And here we're going to configure a couple of vNICs. This is pretty typical of configuring servers. These would be just we call it standard vNICs. So these will carry our iSCSI traffic. And one key piece of information that we must consider is that if we're going to boot using these vNICs, we have to have the iSCSI VLAN configured on them as the native VLAN. This is mission critical, very, very important. In fact, I'm going to circle it in red, because if we don't actually remember to do this, it's going to result in us not establishing an iSCSI connection across the network. Now, these vNICs internally connect to the vSwitch for whatever hypervisor we're running, or if we're running bare metal, by the way, then it just sees these vNICs as being directly attached as physical NICs. And so when we have a VMK or VM kernel port for iSCSI traffic, and it needs to be native on this uplink, meaning that the traffic is untagged. From here, it's business as usual. We connect up through the fabric interconnects, which allows us to form connections from that iSCSI VMK all the way up to the storage array. Again, we have redundant connections. And this is how the iSCSI data stores are accessed through the network. Unfortunately, this doesn't exactly help us to do the boot. And the reason for that is none of this down here is actually in existence. If we haven't booted a server, we don't have a hypervisor yet. We don't have any VMKs. These aren't actually booted up. And so in order for us to actually connect to a boot LUN, so we're actually booting now from this storage array, we need UCS to step in and make this connection for us. And this is where the iSCSI vNICs come into play. So UCS differentiates between traditional vNICs, which, by the way, is still used for iSCSI traffic after the server has been booted. But the iSCSI vNICs themselves are dedicated to the boot process itself. So where do these iSCSI vNICs exist? Well, we could say that, well, of course, they're going to attach into the server somehow like this, right? But actually, that's not how it works. We use this concept of an overlay NIC. And overlay just means that we're going to lay these vNICs logically over an existing vNIC. So, in other words, we're going to put these iSCSI vNICs right over the existing vNICs that we've configured for the iSCSI VLAN. Now, these vNICs are just like any other vNIC. We need IP address and MACs. So where does the IP address come from? Well, recall we created an IP address pool for iSCSI boot. That's where the IP addresses for these vNICs come from. Now, what about the MAC addresses? Well, interestingly, the MAC addresses don't come from a pool. They come from this physical vNIC. Physical vNIC is kind of an ironic term, but not the overlay, but the actual virtual NIC that we created for the iSCSI connectivity. So the MAC addresses are derived from the underlying vNICs themselves. In other words, we don't have to configure a MAC address for these vNICs. Interestingly, by the way, UCS does give us the option to configure MAC addresses on these iSCSI vNICs. We do not want to do that. That will cause problems. So that's an easy trap to fall into, and we'll be sure to cover that when we get to that point in the configuration within these nuggets. Now, as far as the rest of the process goes, the iSCSI vNICs are going to, as part of the boot policy, reach out to each one of these individual interfaces. In fact, we have the option of configuring each iSCSI vNIC to reach out to both interfaces on the storage array, meaning that when we fully draw this out, if both of these are connecting to both interfaces, we end up with 4 different connections as options for reaching across the network. In other words, this is fully resilient, right? If either of those storage array NICs goes down, if as long as only one of them goes down, really, we still have a connection to the other. And if either of the vNICs goes down, which really what that means is one of these fabric interconnects has gone down, then we still have the ability to get out via the other vNIC. So we have a fully redundant solution in this case. Now, one last thing to keep in mind in all of this. Although a lot of this functionality happens as the server is booting up, the connection has to be maintained over time. Because a boot LUN that is up here on the storage array, this contains not only the operating system or the hypervisor install itself, but also the configuration settings, which means that as a hypervisor maybe gets modified throughout the production process, it will come up and it will have to store that configuration on the boot LUN, which means that all of this connectivity continues to happen even while a server is in production. All of these concepts are going to be mission critical to keep in mind as we wrap up our iSCSI boot configuration. We can now explain exactly what an overlay iSCSI vNIC does as part of the boot process, as well as some of the key configuration information that we need to keep in mind, such as the VLAN needs to be native on the iSCSI vNIC, and also the MAC address is derived from the underlay vNIC. We don't want to configure a MAC address on the iSCSI vNICs. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.